am the heir of my ancestors. Probably not what they dreamed of, and yet maybe even more. We all are. We are here because somehow an ancestor found it worthy to bear a child. And so we, in a long lineage, have arrived today. In many ways, what is beautiful is that we inherit all that has come before us. We are the very stars that Abraham once looked at to be reminded of God's promise. Every single one of us. The faith of our ancestors allowed us to take breath. I am named after my grandfather, Jeffrey Morgan. He was a pastor of sorts in Oklahoma. Guarantee you he did not expect the pastor in the family to be a girl. He was a good Southern Baptist man, and I promise you the name of his namesake was not what he thought it would be. And yet I guarantee you I'm even more than he could have dreamed of. I have a beautiful gift in my family that people tend to live longer than most folks do, which means I get to hear stories from ancestors past. Some of you may know that my grandmother, my last living grandparent, lived to be 106, and she rose in power on June 25th of this summer. Her faith, while it manifested very differently than mine, is the source of my understanding of my belovedness. You see, I am the heir of my ancestors. I think all of us are. And while I guarantee you my grandparents would not have expected it, for one side was staunch Catholics and the other are staunch Southern Baptists, the one thing we have in common, while it looks quite different, is our faith. And while our faith and practices today look quite different than Abram and Sarai, we are their descendants. And what's interesting is they only saw two of their heirs. Abram saw two of his heirs, Ishmael and Isaac. And it is from the line of Isaac that we get the line of David. And from the line of David, we get Jesus. And so too, we find our ancestral faith. Could you imagine being told that you would have descendants as countless as the stars? Not minding how old you were when God spoke to you to tell you this. That would be hard enough to believe. But then only witnessing the first generation of the countless stars. The promise that God made to Abram carried on through the generations. It began while he was alive, but he did not see it fully fulfilled. It'd be quite remarkable if he did, if they were all countless as the stars, I suppose. But you see, because of Abram's faith, we gather here this Sunday morning to worship a God of love, a God of promise, and a God of faith. Faith is this weird thing. Do you have enough of it? We try to measure it. We sometimes have a crisis of faith. Sometimes we call it the dark night of the soul. Faith is this thing we talk about and can feel very ambiguous. And yet it's the very living breath that we take. It's active. It's very present. But it's also past and it is future. It is God. And for the faithfulness that God has had throughout generations, we get to trust that faithfulness to be true for us today. When I was in Bible college in Canada, I had this professor, Todd Slechta. And he was our Old Testament professor, and he was fantastic. And he taught us this wonderful African term that comes from Mother Ethiopia called Sankofa. As you travel forward, remember your past so you know who you are in the present. It is signified by a bird flying forward with its head back and the egg of knowledge in its beak. Every time we take communion, read scripture, share stories, we live Sankofa. Our faith is rooted in the past, always striving us forward to what we do not know and rooting us in the present. He was also the professor who taught me that if I do not have faith at that moment, it would be all right, because I could lean on somebody else's faith until mine returned. He was the one to teach me that my faith was not individual, that it was communal, and that when I may not believe the things that I had always believed, in those crisis of faith moments that made me wonder if I could ever make it through seminary and still believe in God. It's true, if you've been there, you know. It was because of a communal faith that allowed me to continue to believe. Faith is this funny, funny thing. We have it in people. We sometimes have it in society. I've lost my faith in society. I'm sure many of you have heard that over the years. But we also have this faith that transcends time, that allows us to have the courage of those who have gone before us to do great and mighty things. I was reminded as I was reading our text for today of the saying that says, if we do not remember and learn from history, it shall repeat itself again. And while I'm sure at any moment throughout time people felt that to be true, I know I have felt it quite recently. And yet I wonder, if we simply learn from it, can we heal? As if remembering history and learning, would that actually be enough to heal? I think there's a missing part to that saying that would allow healing. I think it's the faith of our ancestors, and learning it so and letting it dwell within us will allow us to heal the world. Because you see, they have already gone before us. They know what they would do differently. We can learn from them. I think of Abraham and his journey and the things that we could learn from him. Trusting God in foreign spaces, so much so that Sarah doesn't end up in a leader's quarters. David, while he has many wonderful qualities, probably would also teach us not to use your power to go after a woman who is married and then harm her husband. For Judah, to remember the Levirate law of taking care of your sons' wives. He probably would say, do so even if you're afraid that your son will die. Because he learned that the hard way, that God still took care of Tamar. I think Mary Magdalene might teach us that when rumors begin about us, even when there is no grounding for them, many believe she was a prostitute, and yet that's nowhere in Scripture, oddly enough. And yet, she would probably say, keep your faith, move forward, and proclaim the truth. Our ancestors are wise. Our ancestors are rich with wisdom that bestows to us. We get that wisdom. The more I learn from womanist theology and from other cultures that really honor ancestors, I'm reminded what it means to call forth upon our ancestors. Those who have gone before us, maybe not as far back as Abram and Sarah, but maybe. But even those from recent past, those who would tell us how to live differently, to say maybe humble yourself a little bit more and be wrong a bit more often. It will allow you to learn. You see, I think our ancestors are the ones that will give us the strength to heal a world that seems so torn apart. Because if we do it on our own, we lose the richness of our past. And if we lose the richness of our past, we often don't know where we're heading. The hard part is sometimes we don't want to actually know who our ancestors were. Maybe we're not proud of who our ancestors were or what they did. Maybe we believe they stood on the wrong side of history at any given point, and we want to pretend that they are not part of our legacy. But all that does is a chance for history to repeat itself. You see, our ancestors are both good and faithful, for they did what they knew in that moment. But they also learned from their mistakes and invite us to do the same. And I think about how often we want to look at the world in rose-colored glasses. Everything's going to have a silver lining. Everything's going to be okay. And yet sometimes that means we dismiss all the struggle that our ancestors had gone through. For many, even being alive today means that their ancestors did something quite remarkable. And sometimes in our ancestral history, we have to admit that there were atrocities done. And that's hard. That's why we get to revise history and the stories that we choose to tell. And yet, what if we were allowing ourselves just a bit to acknowledge the good, the bad, the messy, the mistakes, and the beautiful choices collectively? We would get the full picture as best as we could. And in that full picture, we would be able to glean whatever we needed from our ancestors in that moment. Often in church, the only time we really talk about our ancestors is on All Saints' Day. And oftentimes it's just the ancestors from the previous year who have gone before us. But our ancestors are vast and broad. They're from Scripture. For me, it's the early church mystics, Catherine of Siena, early theologians down through the ages, my congregations, my pastors, my professors, and my family. These are my ancestors who guide me each and every day when I allow them to be present. But it requires me to actually know who I am. And knowing who I am is the first step in healing the world. Because I can't heal anyone if I'm not healed myself. And that means I have to deal with me. Maybe y'all have already dealt with yourselves and you're good. But I'm a continual dealing. I don't know about you. And so there's a lot to continue to heal. There is a lot to continue to learn. And in that, I get the freedom of saying, this is my faith as I understand it now. It may not be the same tomorrow, but for today, this is how I know to be faithful. And while that can be scary because we like prescriptive faith and step 1 leads to step 2, what it allows for is to say, man, I don't know what's coming next, but I know that in this moment, I have a chance to not only heal myself, but maybe inspire some healing in the world. Because if we all allow God to break through and heal within us, and healing happens in many ways. Sometimes it's individual, sometimes it's going to a therapist, sometimes it's long conversations with family and friends, sometimes it's being out in nature and moving. Healing happens in unexpected ways, sometimes by choice and sometimes by surprise. But when we allow healing, we allow faith to meet us anew. And in that meeting anew, through those moments where brokenness feels like it's starting to heal and mend, we realize it's being mended together by the light of Christ. And so through each of those wounds and each of those broken moments, the light of Christ shines into the world in meaningful ways. And the graciousness of that is that we don't have to heal the world on our own. I grew up thinking that it was our job to make everybody well, to ensure everybody was saved, and to ensure that I did everything I could. But what that taught me was that it was all about me and my abilities to be a Messiah. And anyone in my family will tell you I am not a Messiah. And so thanks be to God, it does not rely on us. It relies on God, being able to move throughout the world, in and among and through us, to heal a broken and hurting world. We get to be vessels for that. And what I love at the end of the exchange between Abram and God is that the language isn't quite clear of who is speaking when righteousness is spoken of. Some believe that the Lord is saying, and because Abram is righteous, this will be. Others believe it is Abram saying, because God is righteous, I can trust in this promise. And I love that. I love that image that because God is righteous, we can trust in God. God will continue to be whether we acknowledge God or not. And that is a mighty thought to believe. But how great is it that we worship a God of co-creation who invites us to create and to heal with God. Our ancestors did it as best as they knew how, I believe. But the trick is, it doesn't end with our ancestors. It continues each and every day with us saying, I choose to have faith. While I may not understand, while I may not see the promises fulfilled, and while I may not see how this is going to work out, I choose to lean on the faith of my ancestors and be propelled forward in my faith into a future of unknown. And in all of that, God invites us to be present in this moment. Our faith is not just our own, it is what we have inherited. And as any parent in this congregation knows, you may pass on your faith as best as you know how. That doesn't mean your children will choose it in the ways that you wish they did. What it means is you have faith that you have passed on the traditions and teachings and lessons and practices of your faith, and that you invite them to acclaim them as their own when they are able. Our ancestors invite us every single day to do the same. Our faith may look different than theirs. We may believe differently. But a faith in a loving God that fulfills God's promises links us from one generation to the next. And by their wisdom, I genuinely believe that as we welcome them into the present, we will be able to heal the world because of their courage that they pass down to us. One day we will be the ancestors. Our faith will be passed down. And the question will be, will they lean upon us and the wisdom we have gained in our life to live their best life in that moment? You see, faith does not end. It is in Kairos time, no beginning, no end. It transfers from one generation to the next. And as I look out, I see the beautiful stars of Abraham and Sarah's promise. So lean into their faith. Go out into this world. Be healed yourself. And do something quite radical. Don't just remember history. Allow your ancestors to help you heal the present. Because one day, the future will be the past. And will our descendants say that we healed as best as we could? By the faith of God and with the help of God, they will say yes. Amen.